Okay.
Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Okay, so as usual, before getting into the third chapter, I'm going to just spend 2 minutes. My purpose is I want to remind everybody that Vedanta is not merely recognizing that you're the witness. If that was the case, we don't need the Gita. We can all do that right here and right now. So what is the purpose? Can you strip away the teaching of the Gita from this knowledge of the self? That what is the real knowledge of the self? Is it recognizing that you're the witness, or is it something more than that? And if so, who's the qualified person to realize that truth? The idea that I want to bring is that you can't separate the Bhagavad Gita from Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta means the Gita, that there's not just the final teaching, that there's only one reality. There's a teaching about how to realize that reality. Obviously, it can't be like how we realize everything else in this world, because this reality is not perceivable by the senses. It can't be inferred, because we can only infer something after perceiving something. So there's no way to infer it. There's no other means of knowledge to know it. So, and it can't be objectified. So the knowledge of the self, when they talk about it, it has to be understood properly. I wanted to, so since you can't separate the rest of the teaching of the Gita, where does all of these practices and practical sadhanas fit in? And it's not merely to understand that there are other sadhanas, it's really to understand where do we fit in on the practical steps. Everybody is not at the same step. So once we know the different sadhanas, we can see what we're capable of. And if we're not capable of that, you can do something that is not, if you're not up to that, there's something previous to that and something previous to that. So there's a graded sadhana that qualifies you for the knowledge of the self. Without being qualified, this is another important thing, that this knowledge cannot arise for someone who's not qualified to realize it. Why is that? It's the same witness in everybody. As soon as we turn back, we can realize it. Why is it that it's only the qualified person can realize it? And what does it mean to be qualified? So this is part of the Bhagavad Gita teaching, that if you haven't studied the Gita, you would not know about this. And for people who teach Advaita but don't know the Gita, they don't know what's in the Gita, they heard that it's a non-dual text, but they've never really studied it. They have all sorts of wrong ideas about it. Ramana Maharshi was asked, should we read the Gita? Because he was just saying, ask who wants to read the Gita? I do. Who's that I? That's what if that's the real direct path. So the Gita, even though it teaches maybe Advaita, that's not the direct path. So someone once asked him, should we read the Gita? So he said, yes, you should read the Gita every day. In talks with Ramana, yes, you should read the Gita every day. And then the person asked him, should you read the Bible? And Ramana Maharshi replied, of course, you should read the Bible every day. The Gita and the Bible teach the same thing. This was in the 40s and 30s after Vivekananda. All the Neo-Vedantins had this idea that ultimately all religions are one. Ramana Maharshi used to quote the Bible, which says, be still and know that I am God. And he said, that's Vedanta. I am that I am. That's Vedanta. Me and my Father are one. That's Vedanta. So the Bible teaches what the Gita teaches. In fact, you can just study the Bible because it's teaching that same truth. This idea, this pernicious idea that monotheism, the religion of the Bible, is in some way related to the Gita teaching, is because he didn't understand the Bible and he didn't understand the Gita. He never studied the Gita and he's making these pronouncements. There's just one other thing I wanted to say, and then I'll get right into it, which was last week I was discussing about how many famous and revered non-dualists have described how they became enlightened. Everybody knows Ramana Maharshi, what happened to him as a 16-year-old boy, what he did. And then there's Eckhart Tolle's enlightenment experience is quite well known. All independent, different ways they got it. But Nisargadatta got it in a different way than Ramana Maharshi and then Eckhart Tolle, and he even got it in a different way than Muji. Muji just went to satsang and he got it. But that's not how Nisargadatta got it. So I like to read in his own words how he describes his enlightenment experience. I actually pulled it up. So let me see if I can quickly locate that. In his own words, quote, when I met my guru, he told me, quote, you are not what you take yourself to be. Find out what you are. Watch the sense I am. Find your real self, end quote. I did as he told me. All my spare time I would spend looking at myself in silence. And what a difference it made, and how soon. It took me only 3 years to realize my true nature. His message to us was simple and direct, with no propounding of scriptures or doctrines. So that idea of abiding in yourself for a week or a month or 3 years, and then somehow somebody realized the self, is just one other way of the Neo-Vedantins. It has nothing to do with the method of Vedanta. It's because they don't know that method that these ideas are floating around. So, let me begin. If you remember, Krishna taught Arjuna the true nature of the self. dogmatically. The self is unborn, undying, all-pervading. Fine. And he said, by knowing that, you'll be free. Then he said, Arjuna, I want you to engage in the battle. So the question comes up in the 3rd chapter. That's what we're up to. If wisdom of the self that is unborn, unchanging, all-pervading, ever blissful, if that knowledge is what frees us, why are you telling me to engage in karma, which just binds a person? If you do something, you get the result of it. It's an endless cycle that never puts an end to anything. Why are you telling me? So he says this. For the person who wants to realize the self, this is the 5th shloka, etasmi asmin loke, in this world, dve nishta pura prokta ana maya anaga, in this world I have taught these 2 paths. Let me say one other thing that I'd like to make clear. There's not many paths. There's not many yogas. There's not Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Samkhya Yoga, Sannyasa Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga. There's only one yoga. Yoga means joining and becoming one with that reality. In our ignorance, we think we're apart from it. That knowledge, which removes that ignorance, is called yoga, jnana yoga, because it joins us and makes us one. When the ignorance is gone, you are one with that. That's yoga. That's the only yoga that there is. Those things that aid Bahir Anga Sadhana, those means which aid the attainment of that knowledge are called the auxiliary means. Because to get to the stage of Jnana Yoga, the mind has to be of a certain quality. It must have the capacity to discriminate the subject from the object, the self from the not self, and to see that the self is actionless, timeless, birthless, and to see that the not self not only doesn't affect me in any way, it has no reality apart from me. This is called Samkhya. That path, for those people who are at that stage, and you may be at that stage, for those people at that stage, that means their minds are not only introvert, unlike everybody else's mind, Arjuna's mind, I'm going to kill them, they're going to kill me, our minds, I'm going to make money, I'm going to buy that new car. The mind that's extrovert, this discriminative faculty is obscured. The mind that's able to do this, not just on Thursdays or for a few hours and then back to normal, but the person who can do this discrimination by which he rejects the idea that he's a doer because he's seen the witness of all of the activities, the gunas, that they're doing everything and I do nothing. That's called Samkhya Yoga. But to get to that condition, because It's not a question of you get a badge. Okay, everybody knows whether they can do that or not. Examine your day to day. Were you totally identified with your mind and your body and all your concerns? And if you weren't, that's because you've taken your mind away from that and introverted it. If not, you're reading about the election, COVID is surging. What should I do? What should I avoid? For the person who is a mumukshu, who only wants and desires intensely liberation, in order to get the qualification for this discriminative knowledge so that you can get established in this discriminative wisdom, and let me clarify, this discriminative wisdom is not the end. Merely by knowing I do nothing and everything is just going on is not the final knowledge. But that is the first step in getting free by not being attached through this discrimination, not being attached to the very action and the fruit, none of it, to see the witness which is unattached always, ever the same, unchanging. That's the nature of the self, unchanging because it's timeless. In order to get to that where it's not merely a intellectual appreciation, but that the mind is looking at the fact of the matter. Does everything appear and disappear in consciousness? Is that the experience? The mind that has the capacity, the samarthyam, the ability to do this, is a mind that is introvert, subtle, pure, and not only that, because through karma yoga, the mind does become introvert. Through the practice of karma yoga, karma means your activities. It basically refers to all the things that you do with your body. Of course, it refers to your mental actions and your sense actions, but primarily karma yoga is the things that you do. And if you do it in a particular way, the mind will have lost interest in the fruit of that action and will have turned towards that inner self that abides ever shining in your own mind, the self of everyone, turning back towards that. But there's another quality that we have to cultivate in this type of pursuit, which is what's called ekagrita, one-pointedness of mind. It's not merely enough to go back for a moment and then the mind is out again, but the capacity of the mind to go in and to stay in. Whenever it goes out, to pull it back in again. That capacity, that one-pointedness of mind, comes from meditation. So the Gita teaches not only how to do karma, to make the mind introvert and subtle and pure, but it teaches certain types of meditations, they're called upasanas, that make the mind one-pointed on this subject matter. And this is taught in the 8th and 9th chapters, 2 types of meditation. So the Gita teaches as a practical thing, all of these things, all of the practicality that people ask about, it should be understood. These practices only give a partial benefit. That the mind has become introvert doesn't mean you'll realize the self. That the mind is one-pointed doesn't mean that you'll realize the self. But those are the prerequisites for the knowledge of the self. In order to have the dispassion, the vairagya towards the world, there are certain practices, sadhanas, that allow that to happen. And part of it is discrimination. So even to get to dispassion, a certain amount of discrimination is required. Not the discrimination by which we come to know the self and the not self, but the discrimination to know that nothing that I do, no effort that I make will ever put an end to my ignorance. The only purpose of making efforts is to make the mind fit enough to understand 3 words. You are that. There's no other teaching. That's the Gita teaching. I'll show you as we go through the verses that that's the Gita teaching. You are that, one with that. In order to realize that, though, so that once you realize it, not only will you attain the infinite bliss that you've been searching for, Ananta Ananda Prapti, you'll attain infinite unending bliss by this self-knowledge. Sarva Dukkha Nivritti, there'll be the removal instantaneously of all suffering. This knowledge, the moment it arises, produces infinite bliss and the end of all suffering. That's the test of knowledge. If you think I have the knowledge, but I'm suffering a little, or I forget the knowledge, or I'm still in duality, then that is not called Atma-jnana. That is not the knowledge of the self. Not in Vedanta. To get qualified for that knowledge, the whole Gita is begun. If you remember in 247 in the 2nd chapter, the verse said, you Arjuna, you don't know the self. You think you're a warrior. If you stop doing your duty now, there'll be no benefit. Not only that, if a warrior doesn't do his duty, he'll be incurring a bad outcome. So just from a practical point of view, you must engage in your duty. An ignorant person must engage. That's Arjuna. And so for Arjuna, and that means us, for the seeker, the practical thing, even though the knowledge of the self is what puts an end to all suffering and produces infinite happiness, to get qualified for that knowledge, the sadhana has to be like this. Let me tell you why this karma yoga. Why can't I do some other thing? Karma yoga is good, but maybe It's because I don't know myself, because we don't know ourselves, everyone, without exception, has nothing to do with sex, culture, historicity, time and history. Everyone, without exception, has this natural idea that I am this. Everyone identifies with the body. I said everything appears in consciousness, is an object to consciousness, disappears. The objects are not consciousness, and consciousness is not the objects. But everybody says, I am fat, I am tall, I am young, I am old, I am worried, I am happy. All the qualities that are objects, we've identified. The outcome of this identification with the object, even though I'm the subject, is what's called ignorance. Arjuna was in it. We're in it. The whole Gita teaching takes place in it. Without a vidya, there's no teachers, there's no teaching, there's nothing to. All empirical dealings are only because of this. Unless you take yourself to be this body, mind, and senses, you can't be a knower. And unless you're a knower, you can't know the world. The whole thing is based on a misconception, a mixing up. In order to remove this, we have to realize who I am and what I'm not. That discriminative capacity, that faculty, that spiritual faculty by which I can separate my mind from the consciousness, the thoughts from the witness, what's changing from what's not changing. This subtle discrimination takes a capacity and a one-pointedness. So, with that in mind, and understanding through that lens, we can understand that there are two paths. For the person who's realized this, whose mind has been made fit enough, and he can discriminate, and the mind is established there, there's no karma yoga. There's no meditation. There's no need for it. They've served their purpose. They're like a canoe that once you get to the other side, that's it, you can leave them. But for the person who wants to get to the other side, the canoe was necessary. How to purify the mind? If what's necessary is a pure mind, how do we, what does it mean impure? And what is a pure mind? And what is a one-pointed mind? And then we can examine our own minds to determine whether they have these qualities or not. So let me read a few of the verses from the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, just to show you that I'm on track with this. So after he says there's these two paths, then he says, for the person who doesn't have this discriminative wisdom, who knows that the self does nothing, does no karma, who sees in the karma no karma at all, that person cannot and need not engage. But for the ignorant person who feels I am a doer, Krishna says in the 4th verse, man doesn't attain actionlessness, freedom from action, merely by giving up action. If you want to attain actionlessness, you would think, then I should give up actions. But Krishna is saying, if you want to attain actionlessness, don't give up actions. The next line says, and if you want to attain perfection, you won't get it merely through renunciation. I'm going to renounce all the actions. I'm not going to do anything. An ignorant man who decides, I want to be actionless, so I won't do anything. I will renounce all actions. He doesn't attain actionlessness, nor does he attain perfection. That's the 4th verse. Then what? If I want to attain actionlessness, which obviously Krishna is saying that's what we have to attain, I want to be free from actions because actions bind me. These very actions are the bondage, because action just doesn't mean doing something. The word karma means action, but it has what it means is in order to do something, there has to be time, because all actions take place in time. And there has to be a place where I do the action. And there has to be instruments, a body, senses, a mind by which I perform the action. That whole thing is called karma. That's karma. Not merely the action, but the idea that I'm doing it, that I'm going to get the result of it. All of that is karma. And if you want to be free from that, Krishna says, if you want to attain naishkarmya, the state of being free from actions, you won't get it merely from ceasing to act. Okay. Then he makes fun of this person. He says, Kamindriyani samya yaste manasa samcharan. He who sits doing nothing, but his mind is on the objects of desire. He sits doing nothing, but his mind is on the objects of desire, because merely by sitting with nothing, the desires for the objects won't go. So he who sits doing nothing, but whose mind is revolving on the objects of desire, he is a vimudatma. He's a deluded soul. Mityachara. He's a hypocrite. This person who says, I'm not doing anything, I have nothing to do, I've withdrawn from all actions. He's deluded. The agent is the one who does, and he's the same agent who's withdrawn. He's the same agent who's going to do again. And even though he said, I'm not going to do anything, he really can't stop doing anything for a moment. Why? Because an ignorant man is attached to this body, mind, and senses. The blood is flowing. He can't stop that. He can't stop breathing. He can't stop thinking for 2 minutes. If he can do it for 2 minutes, it'll come rushing back. This person is a vimudatma, a deluded soul. This is not the way. So the Gita is teaching us, if you want to get this perfection, If you want to get free from karma, the first thing I'm going to tell you is you must engage in karma. But I'm going to tell you the secret of how to do this very same karma that you've been doing before, but to do it in a peculiar way so that it no longer becomes a bondage to you. That the very karma that was a bondage, because in order to do karma, I had to have a body. That's a bondage. In order to do karma, I needed a mind. The mind is our worst enemy. In order to, if I did karma, I'm going to have to get the result of it. That's another type of bondage, because it may not be the result I wanted. So the whole thing is a bondage. How to get free from that whole thing of time, space, doer, the instrument that's doing it, the fruit of it. How do we get freed from that? Not by stopping doing. That's the message. None indeed, even for a moment. No one who's ignorant, even for a moment, remains without doing karma. All beings are dependent because they have a body. They must do karma. They're dependent and they're made to work. It's not a decision of ours. Once I'm this body, I must work. Once I identify with the not self, I must work. They are made to work by nature. This body is said to be made up of the elements. It's called Prakriti, nature. I'm identified with this nature, and because of that, I'm forced to work. Once I take myself to be this, I am this. The I, that's the witnessing consciousness that never changes. Once I take that I to be this, there's an identification with this, then I become a doer. And no matter what I do, I can't remove this misconception, because the very doing is the outcome of the misconception. But if I stop doing, the misconception won't go away either. Because the idea that I'm going to stop doing is up to the agent. The very agentship is already because of an ignorance. Therefore, for that person, if he just tries to control the organs of action, but he's thinking about the objects of his desires, he is a deluded person. He's a hypocrite. But for the person, Arjuna, us, but for people like us, controlling the sense organs that are naturally extrovert, that natural tendency of the senses to go out and the mind to follow after them. The senses objectify an object. The mind decides that it's likable or dislikable. If it's likable, we proceed to get it. If it's something unlikable, this type of mind, controlling that senses so that the mind is not roving from object to object. Manasa, the mind controlling the senses. He who does this, he excels. Not the one who's withdrawn from actions, but the one who engages in the actions but controlling the senses. Number one, slowly we're going to get the characteristics of what this karma yoga is. Controlling the senses by the mind. The mind has to keep in mind that those objects that the senses want are really a source of suffering. The mind is naturally, the senses that are naturally outward and want to get the objects, by the mind that knows that those objects will not only bring me lasting happiness, they'll be the source of suffering. Those very objects that I took to be a source of happiness are the womb of suffering because they're in time. This type of vairagya, dispassion towards those things, because what I want is infinite happiness. That's what the Gita is being taught to. The person who's seeking not temporary happiness. So he has to control his senses, but continue in the action. That person, he should always do whatever is required of him or her. What that means is, whatever your duty is, in the West, whatever is required of you as a professional, as a job, as a husband, as a wife, as a father, as a child, to your parents, your duty to your children. There's so many, whatever they are, you continue with those. Don't stop doing them and retire to a cave in the Himalayas. Don't go to satsang and recognize yourself and then say, I do nothing. The first step is to control the senses and to get some vairagya towards those objects. The person who's filled with desire and lust and greed and hatred for whatever gets in his way, this knowledge is a million miles away. That's why the qualified student is so important here for this knowledge. It's not like modern Vedanta that anybody can get this here and now. No, according to the Gita, anybody can't get this. According to Shankaracharya, anybody can't get this. Who can get it? The qualified student. I can talk a lot about that where it's discussed in other texts, but I'm going to keep it here in this text. Because the Gita is a complete text. There's nothing missing in this text that you have to go to the Upanishads for. This is the essence of the Upanishads. This Advaita text, with all the practical sadhanas, is all contained in here. I'll just mention as an aside, there's only two things, if I may be so bold as to point out. There's two things the Gita doesn't discuss. There's no discussion in all 18 chapters, 700 verses of the three states, waking, dream, and deep sleep, which is such an important part in the Upanishads. The Gita doesn't need it because it has another way to reveal this truth. That's just one method, the three states, but just a point. And the other point is, the Gita doesn't discuss explicitly how the teaching, why the sentences of the Upanishads are the only means to know the self. That it's merely understanding the meaning of the words of the Upanishads. Not this, not this. The self is Brahman. You are that. Brahman is nothing but a mass of consciousness. Those sentences, merely understanding the meaning of them, that's all. That idea, which is discussed very thoroughly in other places, is really not discussed in the Bhagavad Gita. It's called Vedanta Vakya Pramanyam. How is the teaching of Vedanta a valid means of knowledge? How do the words themselves produce the direct experience of the self, after which duality will not exist anymore? After knowledge, duality will not exist. Gyate dvaitam na vidyate. When this is known, duality cannot exist. This knowledge is the one we want. As long as there's duality, there's dukkha. But I said this knowledge produces the total end of all suffering. And there's nothing more to be done. No tendencies, vasanas to remove, nothing to be practiced, no chance of falling back into samsara. This is the Atma Jnana. So this knowledge is not like the knowledge that we have of worldly things. If I mistake a rope for a snake, now I know it's only a rope. It's still possible tomorrow I could come by and look at that rope and again mistake it for a snake. Why is it that after I know the self, the next day I may forget it and once again fall back into taking myself to be other than I am? What is the difference between Atma Jnana, the knowledge of the self, and empirical knowledge when we know something correctly and remove a misconception? When we remove a misconception in the world, a snake for ropes, when we remove the silver from the shell, the water from the sand in the mirage, and I know the truth, I may know her, the object is known, and after I know it, I'm still a knower, and then the next day, I may not know it. Because I'm still a knower, it doesn't remove that knowledge about the rope, the silver, doesn't remove the basic ignorance about ourselves. But when the basic ignorance about ourselves is removed, this is the difference. There's no more knower. The misconception was that you're a knower. In worldly example, the misconception is about the thing, not that you're a knower. But in the ignorance concerning the self, we've taken the self to be a knower. When the ignorance is gone, you're not a knower. You are the unchanging reality. For those who think after I remove the ignorance of the self, I'm still a knower, they don't know what the ignorance of the self is, and they don't know what it means to remove that ignorance. So the teaching of the Gita is that first off, we must act. Karmani eva adhikaraste. Your qualification as an ignorant person is to engage in action. This is the Vedantic teaching. You must act, number one. He says in 9, all the acts that are done, all karmas, every action that you do, all the world is bound by action. Whatever action you do, whatever the worldly actions are for anyone, they bind you. They're a bondage. The bondage is that to do an action, you have to be this body. Limited, fragile, temporary. filled with diseases, this body, to do any actions. So that's the very bondage. If you're an actor, you have a body, you're bound by that action. The whole world is bound by action. Other than those that are done as a sacrifice. Now let me spend a few words about this. Doing actions, not in the normal way. The normal way is I do my action to get the result. Now, instead of that, doing those very same actions with an inner attitude. The action is the same, but the desire for the fruit is gone because I know the fruit is not going to bring me what I want. I've lost interest in the fruit. I'm dispassionate towards the fruit. I have no attachment towards the fruit. And I'm going to do that action as an offering, as a sacrifice to the Supreme Being. Now, when I say Supreme Being, I don't mean the theological monotheistic God who lives in heaven, nor in any loka somewhere, or Vaikuntha, or Goloka. What I'm talking about is that Supreme Self that abides in the hearts of all beings, who is the self of everyone, that consciousness in which everything arises, not only when you say that from which all this arises, it doesn't mean not only all the duality, all the activity, my activity, where is it arising from? Everything arises in that consciousness, including all the activity, that from which all my activity and the activity of everything arises from, and that by which all this duality and all the activity, my activity and everyone else's activity, is pervaded by. Offering your actions to that, since everything comes from you, Paramatma, since you pervade everything, without you nothing could be. I'm going to do these actions with my mind turned towards you. That's the yajna. That's what sacrifice means. It doesn't mean like in Vedic times, they had a fire and they did a yajna, a sacrifice, and they offered the ghee and the coconut and the mantras, and those would go up to the god or the gods, and those gods would receive it and in turn bless the people who did the offering. This yajna, this doing your works as an offering means to that self which is in me, which is in everybody, the same self in everybody that's all pervasive and ever present and ever shining, which is infinite, timeless presence, that self, I'm going to turn my mind towards that. That's called offering. Offering the actions to that, tying up the karma to that, yoking the activity to that. That karma, when it's performed like that, there's two things here. No desire for the fruit of the action, you've lost it. That's called dispassion or vairagya. And doing the action now where it's joined to that supreme being that's lighting up the whole thing, that's pervading everything, that's always present, that's all knowing, all powerful. Why is that consciousness all knowing? Because whatever appears has to appear to that. There's nothing that could be known that's not known to that. He's Sarvagnya. In relation to that, he knows everything. In relation to that, he pervades everything. That supreme being is different than me. Why? Because I'm the doer. If I'm a doer, I have a body. So I'm not all pervading. But that all pervading reality which abides in me, I'm turning my mind towards that. I'm doing the action, but I've lost all interest in the fruit. And now I'm doing it with the feeling. It's just a feeling. It's a mental. This karma yoga. On the outside, you're doing the actions the same way, but with a different motive and a different orientation of the mind. You've now spiritualized your mind. By the way, that supreme being, that's all pervading, all knowing, all powerful, that fits the description of the theological God, the supreme person. Turning your mind to that, because in relation to you, an individual, that is the supreme being from which the whole universe has arisen, by which the whole universe is supported, by which the whole universe merges into and is never changed. That supreme being, turning your mind to that, wanting to know that. You see, as our mind turns to that, we want to know, who is that supreme being? What is its nature? That's the beginning of bhakti, in fact. The lower bhakti is, oh God, help me. But when the mind has got into the habit of losing interest in the action and turning back to that, that mind becomes equanimous. If you join with this practice of karma yoga, meditation, I'm going to mention 2 quick meditations that are taught in the Bhagavad Gita. These meditations have nothing to do with the knowledge of the self, just like karma yoga doesn't. It's based on ignorance. But you remember I said it's not merely sufficient to have an inward, introvert mind, the capacity to keep it there, the ekagrata, the one-pointedness. That's what meditation. The meditation allows the mind to get into the habit of keeping on one thing. So the Gita teaches 2 types of meditations that are very interesting. That inner self in everybody is blazing consciousness, shining the light of 1,000 suns, it said. It's infinite light. That light is reflected, a small portion of that infinite light of the self is reflected in the beautiful things in the world. This is just an emotion. This is where the feelings of bhakti, that seeing in the world, this is a meditation. You don't have to close your eyes. Whenever you see a beautiful baby smile, a beautiful sunrise, a beautiful mountain peak, a fantastic concert that transcends, has a majesty to it, a poem that has a beauty to it. In all of those things, each one of them, when you see that thing, it should remind you that that beauty is merely an infinitesimal part of the infinite beauty of yourself. That radiance is an infinite part, just a small part of the infinite radiance of the self. So that whenever you see in the world these things, the idea is that it should take you back. Oh, there's Paramatma shining in the smile of a baby. Whatever is beautiful, whatever has nobility, whatever has excellence, those things, it should bring the mind back to that supreme radiance. That's called Vibhuti Upasana. So besides doing all of your actions in a particular way, by seeing as you in the world these different beautiful things, they should draw your mind back to this, to understand that there's a radiance even greater than that, a beauty that is, this beauty is just a small amsha, a portion of that supreme beauty. That's the unthinkable, unmeasurable, infinite beauty of the self, radiance of the self. That's one type of upasana, filled with bhakti, seeing God in all of the beautiful things, excellent things. It's true that God is in everything, but to see him in the murderer and in the negative things, the mind doesn't easily do that. But to see the radiance in the beautiful things as a practice, this is called Vibhuti Upasana. If you're able to do this, you graduate to the next meditation. Now the idea is not merely to see in each of these individual things the radiance of God, the presence of God, the presence of the self, the supreme consciousness. The next step is called Vishvarupa Upasana, where now you see the whole universe as a manifestation of that consciousness. Wherever you look, you see that it's all nothing but that supreme reality, that feeling, so that the very universe ties your mind, yokes your mind to the supreme. All of this is just a manifestation of that infinite. It appeared in that. It manifests in that. So all of this is a manifestation of that. And so whatever I see, the whole cosmos, stars and the sun and the galaxies and the planets and the people, the whole of it is nothing but the body, the form of that supreme reality. So these are two types of external. You have to look out and see the world, either in a particular form or the whole universe as one form. And in either way, the first one is easier. The second one is more difficult. But these type of practices, they tie your mind up. They become a yoga. Because they lead to the real yoga. The real yoga is not seeing all of this world as a manifestation of the Supreme. That's just a practice. It has nothing to do with the knowledge of the self. It's preparatory to that knowledge. So, I'm going to move on a little quicker here. So the next part is this. Krishna says in the 17th verse of the 3rd chapter, Arjuna, this teaching I'm giving to you, you should do actions because you don't know the self. You are an ignorant man, and the teaching for an ignorant man is to do karma, but do it the way I've told you. But now I'm going to tell you something different. Yastu atmarati eva siyat atmatriptahascha manavaha atmani eva santushtaha tasya karyam na vidyate. For the ignorant man, he must do action. They're to be done, but to be done as karma yoga. But for the person, but for that man who delights only in the self, the only way you can delight in the self is if you know the self. The ignorant man can't delight in himself. But for that one who delights in the self alone, that means he doesn't find any other delight. There's no delight in whatever is other than himself, because whatever other than himself is temporary and therefore a source of suffering. He takes delight, atmani eva ratihi. He revels in that self. Atma triptaha, for the person who is tripta, that means totally satisfied in that self, just like in deep sleep. You are in the self and there's total satisfaction. It's not a feeling of tripta. The satisfaction is remaining as the self. He who revels in the self, who's satisfied in that self, because the self is nitya tripta, eternally satisfied. And he who is santushta, content in the self, this means that yogi, who's a jnana yogi, who knows the true nature of the self and is reveling in that and is satisfied in that, that person, na karyam vidyate, he has nothing to do. He's not like you, Arjuna. You have to engage in the battle. But for the person who knows the truth, who revels in the truth, who's satisfied in the truth, not only is there nothing for him to be done, there's no possibility of him doing anything. He's realized the self that's actionless. I do nothing. For him, there's nothing to be done. He has nothing to gain from work. This person, the karma yogi, by doing work in this way, he purifies his mind. But the person who's established in the self, he has no mind. He doesn't have to purify any mind. He has nothing to gain by doing work, either getting purified or getting the results of some action, nor does he gain by not doing anything. I won't do anything. He won't gain anything by that. I'll do something. He won't get it. And those are the only two choices. But for the wise man, his agentship is gone. He remains satisfied in the self alone. He's not an agent. That person has nothing to do, nothing remaining to do. He doesn't have to practice his knowledge to make it firm. He doesn't have to get established in it. He doesn't have to worry about his samskaras coming and overpowering it. He has nothing to do, Krishna says. But this person who knows the self, I'm now up to 26, but this person who knows the self, he should not tell the ignorant people, don't do any action. Come to class. Don't do any action. Just listen to me. Examine what is the known, what is the knower. Can you see that? If you see that, then you have nothing to do. And so don't do anything. In fact, if you do anything, it's because you haven't recognized that truth. So don't do anything. This is the teacher telling the ignorant person that he's a jnani now and he shouldn't do anything except practice that knowledge. But the Gita has a different teaching. Na buddhi bedam janayet ajnanam. For the ignorant people, that's me, the wise people should not tell them, don't do anything. They should encourage them to act. Just like Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to act, the teaching of the Gita is if you're ignorant, you must act. But there's a way to act. The wise people shouldn't tell the ignorant people, don't act. Na buddhi bedam jana. Don't create confusion in the minds of the ignorant. Tell them to act. And that teacher, Krishna says, that teacher who's telling the ignorant person to act, the person who knows that he doesn't act, and he's telling the ignorant to act, he himself should act perfectly. The person who has nothing to do because he revels in the self, he shouldn't confuse the ignorant by telling them not to act. And he himself should act. That's the verse. "29. Those deluded by nature." Krishna is not talking to the ignorant person. Those deluded by nature, they get attached to the activities of the gunas. The gunas means this body. The body is made up of gunas. Gunas is just nature, modifications of nature, sattva, rajas, and tamas. This mudaha, that's us, the ignorant people, they become attached to this, and therefore they must work. Those people who don't know the real truth, the ignorant people, must work. The people who know the truth, they should not tell the ignorant people not to work. Those who are deluded by nature's constituents, the gunas of Prakriti, nature's constituents, they cling to the works. They're attached to those activities. Those people who are deluded. The knower of the truth, however, should not destabilize these ignorant people and the people who don't know the whole truth. So how should we do works if we're in ignorance? Surrendering all works in me. All works are in you, consciousness. All works takes place in you. The work, the idea to do the work, the time in which the work is taking place, the fruit of the work, all of that takes place in you. Surrendering all of that to you, joining the mind to you, with the mind turned towards that, free from desire, getting free from the desire to enjoy the fruits of your actions, yujisva, engage in the battle with no anxiety, whether you're going to win or whether you're going to lose. Fight your hardest, but do it as an offering to me. The battle outcome will be whatever it is. Don't be attached to it. And then he says, that the reason this knowledge about the self and why this ignorance of identifying with the not self is so strong is because of desire. Because the mind is filled with desires that pull the mind out. That's the cause. Because I am ignorant and think I have a body, mind, and senses. And in that mind, there are desires. That desire is pulling the things out, my mind out, my senses out. This is the problem. So Krishna says, Kama Esha Krodha Esha Rajo Guna Samudbhavaha. That this desire and anger are all indications of rajas, the rajoguna, that the mind is filled with passion. When you see that there's desire and anger, you should know that's rajoguna. And you have to overcome that rajas by becoming sattvic. You overcome rajas by sattva. How does the mind become sattvic? When the mind is out, it's rajas. When the mind turns back towards that, away from the objects, that's called the sattvic mind. That overcomes the rajas. This is how the karma yoga is working. This is the practical aspect of Vedanta. People could say, I don't want any of this business. You'll see, your mind won't be capable. You'll read all the books. You'll study. You can give all the answers, memorize all the quotes. Unless the mind is fit, unless the instrument is capable. This truth is the most the most subtle, the most subtle. And so the mind has to be made similar to it. It has to become introvert and subtle and one-pointed, not jumping out again, in and again. It's kind of like when a jeweler, who's an expert jeweler, and the people have come across a diamond, and they go to the best jeweler, and they say, what is the value? What is the true nature of this diamond? Is it a D? Is it a flawed? So the jeweler, who's an expert, because he's been looking at diamonds for decades, he puts in his molecule, or whatever that thing is, and he stares at that diamond. his mind, his eyes is focused, and he stares at it. And because of his knowledge of diamonds, by staring at it, the nature of that diamond reveals itself to that expert. The other people, they don't have the capacity. That's why they brought it to him. And he stares at it. The same way the mind has to keep turning back to that, staring at it, trying to understand its nature, that it will reveal itself, that the nature of the self, like a diamond, when the mind turns towards it, it reveals itself to that introvert, one-pointed mind. How long do you have to keep the mind there? Until it reveals itself. That's the practice. After it reveals itself, there's no more practice. He now knows the truth of the diamond. But of course, in this example, he's still a knower and the diamond is known. That's not Atma-jnana. But this is the simile, the analogy. The mind has to become like a jeweler, ratna pariksha, like staring at a jewel in order to, but if the mind is out, it can't stare at the Atman. That inner turn, that's the spiritual journey. That's the practical. And karma yoga, unless we lose our interest in the object and we turn our mind, we associate the action with that reality. Then what happens? You don't realize the self. And you don't get freed from the bondage of karma merely by not wanting the fruit. The fruit's coming. You're going to have to, as long as you do the action, whether you want the fruit or not, you did it, you get the result. The only difference here is the attitude towards the result. I didn't do it for the result. And whatever the result is, I'm unattached to it. The result is going to come. Sukha or dukkha. Some result. But the karma yogi, he accepts that as prasada. Everything comes from him. Everything abides in him. It's all his. Whatever fruit comes, it's coming from that. That's called prasada buddhi. The mind becomes spiritualized. This is the karma yogi. He's now on a spiritual path. He's doing all of his actions. No passion, dispassionate towards the fruit of his action and towards that. I'm going to tell you quickly one more step in this karma yoga, because we're not going to quite get to it here, is that when the mind becomes pure by this practice, the capacity to discriminate becomes better. And when the discrimination becomes better, then we're able to see the fact. The karma yoga is just based on faith. There's some ultimate being that's consciousness that we don't know if there really is. It's an article of faith that some guru said do it. But when you get the discrimination by which you realize the self is the witness and the body is witnessed, and they're like light and darkness of opposite natures, they can never be mixed up. Then the attachment not only to the fruit of the action, but to the very action, the very idea to do the action, I have nothing to do with any of it. That's called the attainment of actionlessness. By doing action, without stopping action, I realize I do nothing. That it's just the body and the mind and the senses that are acting. I, the witnessing consciousness, which has no parts, can never modify, not in time or space, can never change. I do no action. When that discriminative wisdom comes, now you're finished with karma yoga. That's the pinnacle. When you've, through karma yoga, you attain actionlessness, because now the mind has got the capacity to falsify the idea that I'm an actor. Now all the actions are going on, but they don't bind you at all. That's called sarva karma sannyasa, the abandonment of all actions. When I say I'm not going to do any action, that's partial abandonment of actions. Because even though I'm not doing walking around, still I'm doing little actions, thinking, breathing, metabolizing. So I can't give up all actions. But when I realize the self is the witness and not the witnessed, I've never been the witness. I'm eternally the witness. Then I become free from the idea that I'm a doer, that there's actions that I do, that I have a body in which I perform actions. That discriminative wisdom in the mind of a karma yogi, he's the one who frees himself. These are the stages. Once he realizes, I do nothing, I'm this actionless self, he's got to that stage where he revels in that. He finds his happiness in that. For him, karyam na vidyate. There's nothing that he has to do in terms of doing karma as an offering to the Supreme with no, he has nothing to do with that. And I'll tell you what he has to do, believe it or not, even after you realize the self that does nothing, you're still not finished. You would think that must be the knowledge. But knowing that you do nothing is not the final knowledge. That discriminative knowledge that I'm the self that's always present and never does anything, and the not self is always changing, disappears in deep sleep, appears in waking, appears in dream. That changing not self has nothing to do with my nature. That is not the final knowledge. But now you're freed from all karmas. You know that you do no action. That's called sarva karma sannyasa. That's the first step onto Samkhya yoga. Now you have the discriminative wisdom. You've gone from doing action, then giving up the fruit, the desire for the fruit, then giving up the attachment to the whole karma. Now the mind is just reveling in that. There's still a mind, because when he says his mind, he's satisfied in that. What's satisfied? The mind is satisfied in the self alone. The mind is reveling in the self alone. The mind is content, but that's not the final. Now he has to gain jnana, in which there's no mind. Nobody's content. That contentment is also in duality. So that's not the final stage. So the Gita is so I told you, there's the karma yoga, there's the upasana, meditation, either seeing God in the beautiful things that's taught in the Gita. It's a type of meditation. It's not knowledge, but it purifies the mind, and it makes the mind the capacity to be one-pointed. Because once the mind is one-pointed and introvert, this discrimination is very simple. That the object is object and subject is subject, and they can never be mixed up at any time. Even when I said I am fact, the subject and object was not mixed up. The wrong notion doesn't change the fact. When I take myself to be born and getting old and sick and dying, it doesn't change the fact. And when I know myself to be that unchanging witness, that unchanging consciousness, that doesn't change anything either. It just removes the wrong notion. But the self is the same whether you misconceive it or whether you conceive it properly. Those ideas about the self, I am fact, I am consciousness, they're just two ideas. They have nothing to do with the self. The idea that I am fact doesn't make the self fact. And the idea that I am not fact, the negation of that doesn't remove the factness from the self. I want to read the last shloka of the third chapter and we'll conclude this class. The last two, but I'll read them together. Indriyani parani ahur, indriyebhya paramanaha, manastu parabudir, yobude parastasaha, evam bude parambudva, samstabhya atmanam atmana, jahi shatru mahapaho, kamarupam dorasadam. So these final verses of the third chapter, that's why giving these chapters names, like the third chapter is Karma Yoga. The third chapter is not just Karma Yoga. He said the one who knows the self, he has nothing to do. That's not Karma Yoga. It's just that many things are taught in this chapter, but there's a predominance of the Karma Yoga. But this last part is not Karma Yoga. It ends with the real yoga. This is the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita. This is the only yoga. All other yogas are called yogas because they lead to this yoga. This joining and becoming one with that true self. So the way the Gita says it is like this. They say that the senses are higher. Parani. They say that the senses are higher. Higher than what? Higher than the sense objects. Please follow me on this. This comes right out of the Upanishads, but we'll just take it here. They say that the senses are higher than the objects. Why are they considered parani, superior, higher? The reason is that the objects are far away from me than the senses. They're closer to me. The senses are closer, the objects are further away. One. The senses pervade, it's through the senses that I know the objects. So they are the knowers, they're the instruments by which without the senses, without the eye, I couldn't know color or form. Without the ears, I couldn't know pitches of sound. So the senses are more close to me, they're more pervasive, and they're more subtle. For these three reasons, they say, the Vedantins say, that the senses are higher than the objects. Higher than the senses, though, is the mind. Why is that? The mind, we normally take that the sense organs get the information and bring it to the mind. If the mind is away, if I'm thinking about my friend, even if my eye is open and it has the capacity to see the cup, but I'm thinking of my mind is away, then the senses can't make known the cup. The mind enlightens the senses. It's the mind by which the senses are known. So the mind is more in. It pervades the senses, so it's more subtle, more in, more pervasive, and more subtle. Three things. Then he says, but the intellect is even higher than the mind. The intellect is even more in because the mind, it is said, is the characteristic of that inner sense by which I have doubts and I think, oh, is that a pot or is it clay? Is it a stump or is it a man? Is it a rope or is it a snake? What is it has doubts and ideas, but the buddhi, the intellect, is what decides. It is like this. Whatever the information that the mind has gathered from the senses, the buddhi says it is like this. So they take it that the intellect, and by the way, in Vedanta, when they use the word buddhi, that which knows, that which decides, that's really a synonym for the ego. That the ego, I decide. The mind has been thinking about things, I decide. That buddhi is the one who determines, I determine. So you can take them as one thing. The ego intellect is more in than the mind. The mind is more in than the senses. The senses are more in than the sense objects. So now we're up to the ego. What is the ego? In Sanskrit, the word is the ahamkara. Buddhi is intellect. The ahamkara means the I notion. The I notion. That's the intellect, is this I notion. I am so and so. That's the most in. That's who we really take ourselves to be. The senses, well, I have senses. They're my senses. I have a mind. I have an intellect. But the I that has all of them is the most in. It's the I that knows the intellect, the mind, the senses, and the objects. I know. I decide. So this is the most in, the most subtle. That's as far as you can go, the intellect, the I. This is who everybody takes, that I'm the most in, I. That's the true self. But higher than the buddhi is him, Saha. Higher than that ego, that I notion, which is also an object. It's known by something. There's something that objectifies the ego, that's higher than the ego, that's more in than even the ego, because it objectifies, the ego is out. We thought the ego was the most in. I know, I see, I hear. That inner ego, but more in. The true inner self is not the mind, the intellect, or the ego, but him, the true self, the witness of the ego. That's how this third chapter ends. This is not karma yoga. This is the real yoga. This is what yoga really means. Withdrawing the senses from the objects, withdrawing the senses into the mind, withdrawing the mind into the ego, and then merging the ego into that inner self and seeing that. The next verse says, Evam buddhi param buddha, having known that which is beyond the ego. When you know that true self, which is not the ego that says, I was born, I'm getting so old, I'm getting sick, I'm going to die. I am awake. I had a dream. I slept. Those ideas about ourselves. The self never was awake. He never had a dream. He never went to sleep. This idea, I am awake. I had a dream. I slept. I woke up, is all a misconception, because when you know him who's beyond the ego, always awake, never goes to sleep, has no states, having known him, evam buddhi param buddha, now you can finally give up this enemy, having known that self which is ever free from desire, which is ever free from anger, hate, greed, that self which is ever pure, myself, having known that, cast off this enemy of desire. Through this yoga, not by trying to control your desires. That's just sitting on a spring. Yes, we have to control our desires, but you'll never get rid of them by controlling them. Through this yoga, the real yoga of discriminating, the senses objectify the objects, but what objectifies the senses? The mind. What objectifies the mind? The intellect. What objectifies the intellect? The I. Is there something that objects even more subtle, that can't be objectified? That inner self that objectifies anything but can never become an object to anything or anyone. Having known that, give up this enemy of desire. So when through karma yoga, you can graduate to this realization, then you'll be free from the evil of desire, because desire leads to action, action leads to fruits, and this is what's called samsara. So I think we covered quite a bit here, and I hope you're getting a feeling for this. You should also keep in mind, when the Gita talks about the necessity of karma yoga for an ignorant person, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't discriminate. In fact, the karma yoga, to the extent that it purifies your mind, your discrimination will become better. When the discrimination becomes better, the karma yoga becomes better. You can do it because through the vairagya, the dispassion grows. Merely seeing that the objects are causes of suffering doesn't stop it. It's only when we realize that the objects don't even exist. The first is a halfway house. It's only through discrimination. Trying to give up all actions is impossible until you realize the witness. That can only be done through viveka. That viveka can only be done in a mind that's sattvic. Kama is rajoguna. Desire is born of our nature being filled with passion, and therefore it's filled with desire. When the mind turns in by thinking about God, that supreme being, not worrying about the fruit and getting the discriminative capacity, Krishna later on in the Gita says, by the way, this person who's doing everything for that sake, that's bhakti. For the person who's seeing that in all of the beautiful things, that's bhakti. For the person who's seeing the whole universe as his manifestation, that's bhakti. Every sadhana is filled with bhakti. And Krishna finally says, Bhaktya eva mam abhijanati. By devotion alone, not by showing up in satsang and getting your nature pointed out to you. Bhaktya eva. Eva means alone. There's no other way according to Krishna. Unless you become devoted to that, desirous of that, fall in love with that, because you know that's the source of happiness. That's the object of all desire. I want happiness. That's the source of happiness. I've fallen in love with that bhakti. All through every sadhana, there's bhakti. It culminates in supreme bhakti, where that's all that we have our mind on. Bhaktya eva, by bhakti alone, mam abhijanati, he knows me. Tatvataha, in truth. Mat bhakta, my devotee, the one whose mind has turned to me, that inner light, that shining self that's ever present, ever evident, never hidden. He, that bhakta, who's turned to me, mat bhakta, that mind that has become so pure, so bereft of likes and dislikes, jealousy and hatred, that mind, mat bhakta, buddhi yogam dadami, I give him the capacity to discriminate. For the person who's not a bhakta, whose mind is running after, they don't get that. But when you turn your mind to Paramatma, that mind now in it is released because it's turned to him. You could say, due to that, the capacity to know him. You get, when you turn to him, you get the capacity to know him. That supreme being, Paramatma, the supreme self in everyone. The Gita is a bhakti text. The highest sadhana, right from karma yoga to upasana. And I didn't even mention, I mentioned these two upasanas of seeing God in all the things, or seeing the whole universe as God. But I didn't mention because all of those things just purify the mind. But in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, there's a particular type of method that is not a feeling, oh, I feel like God is in everything. There's a method, this same method that was taught here in 2 shlokas, the whole 6th chapter is going to be a commentary on this yoga. And I'm going to spend some time trying to explain what is that yoga. It's called Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation. In the Upanishads, it's called Adhyatma Yoga, the yoga of the meditation on the inner self. In another place in the Upanishads, it's called Nidhyasana, like staring at a jewel to understand what so that the jewel reveals its true nature just by gazing, no longer doing any discrimination. That's finished. Just gazing with no other thought. What that is, what that means, what's the result of that? Is that purification of the mind, or is that the end of the mind? What is that sixth chapter? And then I'll try to sum up the 18th chapter to show how everything I had been talking fits in a harmonious way. So that by reading the Gita, obviously I'm just touching the surface of this sea of knowledge, but to give you the gist of it so that it's understood correctly. I said this is not a theological text. When I say turning your mind towards Him, I don't mean God in the monotheistic sense. I mean that consciousness, that's your true self. When Krishna says, turn your mind to me, He means that. When Krishna says, I am the witness in all beings, Arjuna. Know me to be, that's who Krishna is. That's who we have to offer everything up to, get devoted to, orientated to, one pointed to. If you say, I don't want to do that, Gail. So I'm going to end the class with that. And I don't think I was too critical of other people today. So that's kind of, we did the third chapter. I told you the last two verses is the only yoga that's taught in the Gita. Seeing that which is beyond the ego. That's the only real yoga. How to get fit enough to do that is the rest of the Gita. I'm going to end the class. If anyone has comments, please post it on the YouTube. I'll try to answer some. I hope, I had said that I would answer certain questions in these classes about what's the difference between Buddhism and this and some other things. I didn't quite touch it, but we have 3 more classes.
Yeah.
There's plenty of time. Hopefully we'll get to a lot of it. Let me end it now. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om.
Hari Om.